Well, then, welcome. I'm Michael Phair, and I'm absolutely delighted to be here today for this session, which I've been looking forward to some time. Um, and it's we've just completed it in October, the Archives Month, and this is just Archives Month plus three kind of thing. That too. Um, and it unfortunately it was my issue that got in the way of doing this earlier in October. I double booked and I was at a conference in Calgary and wasn't able to. And delighted that you're all here today because it'll be quite an exciting session, I think. And I think speaks a great deal to the importance of the work that the individuals are doing here and importance for the gay, lesbian, queer community as such. Um, so I'll start with a little bit of a land acknowledgement, reminding all of us that we're on treaty lands that many Indigenous folks have been part of. And many Indigenous folks have shown us the way forward in terms of remembering and keeping track of things, whether it's through storytelling, whether it's written, whether it's archaeological, all of that, which has helped us to better know and understand the history of Indigenous people in the land here. And I like to think that we are kind of continuing that with them as we move forward in the way that we're working. So we're all part of this, I think, with the Indigenous folks and ourselves. They're all working on this together. So I also want to say that this session is a partnership, that it is being put together by Edmonton Pride Senior Group, but also by SAGE and by the Edmonton Pride Center. So it's the three of us working on this over a long period of time, and have gotten sessions like this every Thursday for a number of months over the last year, and are continuing with that over the next number of months as well, for that too. And there'll be more about that a little bit later. So every Thursday we have a session. So having done the initial, I want to say how excited I am that we're having the session and how much has changed over the years. I remember, I think in 1982, 3, 4, I and a couple others went and collected materials from other individuals we knew who were involved with the queer community and took them to the city archives. And as far as I know, that was the first work that was done on collecting information. That we actually brought a box of stuff. I remember walking in with a couple boxes. I think I kind of forget, not knowing much. And that's putting it politely. I don't think I knew anything, except that it was important to ensure that documents and background and information about ourselves and our community needed to be archived somewhere and kept. And I think that comes from a bit of the sense that for many of us, our background has been deleted in history, pretended it didn't exist or wiped out, kind of thing, in that for many of us. And in order to not have that happen in the future, and particularly for Edmontonians, of course, because that's where we are, but elsewhere, to gather and put things together. That then goes to today, which in the last couple of years, it has seen a great deal of change, and a much more active community and a variety of groups working on getting material, putting together information about our background and our history. And that has been instrumental by a number of key people that have been working on that, including, one of the early things we did was the tour downtown of old places that were important to older gays and lesbians in the city. But with it is all the information put online. There's also groups that are doing gay archives, gay lesbian archives as well. And the city's historical group has done some podcasts on that as well. And today we have three people who have been key in doing all that, who are going to speak to us. The presentations will be quite fulsome. We will likely not have any time for questions. If you have questions, certainly you can put them in the box or whatever, and maybe be answered at a later time. But I think that we will only be able to hear the different presenters. And I've decided that the presenters in the order is Rob Browatzke. Rob is an owner of a club in town. He's also an author, and he's also been involved in the archives as well. And that he will be followed by Jaji, who works at the City of Edmonton Archives, and specifically through funding from the city in this past year. She is working on queer archives and Chinese archives. Today we'll talk about the queer archives. Another day, perhaps the Chinese archives, kind of thing in that too. But that's been a real first to have someone doing that work basically full time, because there's a lot of materials there. And then finally, we'll wrap it up with Jillian, who is with the Royal Alberta Museum, and of course they're the carrier of much of the history of Alberta, both Indigenous and up to the current times. And she will go through kind of what they are doing and some ideas and notions about what they're up to. So I think that's enough introduction, kind of thing. And so, Rob, it's all yours.
Well, hello, everyone. I hope you all can hear me. My name is Rob Browatzke. I am one of the owners of Evolution Wonder Lounge, Edmonton's only surviving year-round gay bar. I'm also involved with both the Edmonton Queer History Project and Rainbow Story Hub. So when those two groups were looking for representatives to speak for them today, they figured they could save time by just having me do both. As Michael said, we just celebrated National Queer History Month in October. One of the events that Rainbow Story Hub and Edmonton Queer History Project did in October to commemorate that was coming out of the City of Edmonton archives. Ron Byers from Rainbow Story Hub managed to get some money out of City Council to fund an archivist. That archivist is Jaja. She's with us today. The first project that the advisory committee that we set up kind of tasked Jaja with was processing specifically a donation that Michael Phair had facilitated to the archives from Dennis Cambly of Times 10. Most of you probably remember Times 10. It was a basically monthly magazine 10 times a year from 1993 to 2005. Part of that donation that had been sitting in the archive basement since 2007 was literally thousands of pictures that Dennis and other photographers had taken for the magazine. So in October, we had two events, one that was kind of invitation only and one that was for the greater public to go through those pictures to try to identify the people, the places, the events of what was going on in them. And I think especially the second event had a great turnout. I think we probably managed to get information on about 90% of those images. There are still some images that hadn't been processed at the time of the event, so I think we're looking forward to doing some more of those in the future. I certainly don't want to take up a lot of time today. I just wanted to point out a couple things, one for each group, that you can kind of get involved in. The first is the Edmonton Queer History Project stories map. I'm dropping that into the chat. That's just an opportunity for you to get online, look at a map of the city, read other people's stories, and more specifically, write your own. So you can contribute. Just put a pin in a place where you had a significant moment in your queer history, whether that is a queer business, a queer owned business, any sort of event, really anything you want. There's not really a lot of rules for that. And then for Rainbow Story Hub, there's going to be just two things I'm going to drop. I'm going to drop one in the chat, which is just the general contribution link if you would like to contribute a story itself. But we are specifically with Rainbow Story Hub right now soliciting paid stories. We do have some budget thanks to the Imperial Sovereign Court of the Wild Rose to do $250 honorariums on stories specifically about the groups, the nonprofit groups, the social groups, the sports groups, the religious groups however you take that, the groups that were really significant in our queer history. There's been so many. I know that there's been some interest solicited so far for some of the women's groups, but nothing is really finalized yet. So certainly, if that's something that you are interested in, please contribute in one of those three ways. And I know Jaja and Jillian are going to talk about donations and how you can do that. For Rainbow Story Hub and Queer History Project, if you have specific photos that you would like donated to the archives, or you would like even just help getting those archives scanned for posterity, just please get in touch with me. I am fairly easy to track down through either of those groups or through my own social media. I am happy to come by, pick them up, and scan those pictures for you, just so that they're not lost. Because going through those pictures at those 2x10 events was truly a wonderful and powerful a moment of just seeing our history, and I really want future generations to be able to do that. So that's all I had to say. If you have questions, you can drop them in the chat. Again, sorry I'm not there in person, but I know Jillian and Jaja are going to have lots of information for you in the rest of the session.
I'm the community archivist at the City of Edmonton Archives. I thought a lot about what to prepare for this presentation, and I thought it might be nice to just go back to the basics of an introduction of what archives are, because I think a lot of people aren't sure what it is and how it includes just everyday people. So if we go to the next slide, please. So there are two kind of uses of the word archives. One of them is that archives are all records of decisions, actions, and memories in all formats, including paper, digital, and audiovisual. So today's presentation is really about your personal archives. And so when I use the word archives, what I mean is any paper, any visual, audiovisual material, any digital material that records aspects or memories of your life. So decisions, actions, memories. So for example, it could be letters or journals that you might have, whether they're online in a Word document or whether they were handwritten. It could be your school records, your employment records. It could be family photos or your own photos, so digital or printed out photos. And audiovisual is also important. So it could be sound recordings, video recordings of events that you went to, of family events, of birthday parties, anything like that. Those all make up your personal archives. So from this definition above, there are two things that I wanted to be clear that archives are not. So archives are not just paper. I think often when you think of archives in movies or in television, they show you shelves and shelves and vaults of paper records. So archives, according to this definition, is not just paper records. It can include digital records and audiovisual, so sound recordings, video recordings. And the second thing that archives are not just old stuff. So there's no age for material to determine whether it fits in an archives or not. So there's no rule that says your material must be 100 years old before it can be considered archival. So archives is really about the context of the material and what it records. So those are two really important things to consider when you think about your personal archives, that it doesn't just have to be paper and it doesn't just have to be something old. So the next slide is the second thing about archives is also archives is a place. So when we talk about the City of Edmonton Archives, the archives is a place that preserves and provides access to these records that we're talking about. So people who work there are called archivists. So the City of Edmonton Archives is home to the collective memory of the city. The archives receives, preserves, and provides access to records that tell the story of Edmonton and the people who live here. So based on that definition on the slide, there are three things that archives do. So first is we receive records. So we take in records of families, of businesses, of organizations, of individuals, related to Edmonton history. We receive those into the archives. And then next is we preserve these records. So we make sure that we're able to preserve these records for long-term access, for long-term posterity, for future generations to research. And we do this in various ways. If you're really interested about conservation of records, we can talk about it. But generally, like temperature, humidity, we make sure it's stored in proper containers, depending on the type of material. And then third, we provide access. So access is a really important part of archives. We take in these materials so that we're able to carry on the history of these materials for people who are interested in learning more about their communities, who are interested in researching more about their organization, their business. It could relate to succession planning for organizations, anything like that. But a really key part of archives is open access to these materials with privacy of individuals in mind as well. So as Rob mentioned, the City of Edmonton Archives has a collection of LGBTQ plus records. So he mentioned the times 10 records, but we also have different organizations. So Women's Space magazine, we're working on the HIV Edmonton records so that will be accessible for research soon. And you'll notice while we have these big collections and these big organizations and these groups, and they're important, but the stories of these everyday lived experiences are just as important. So I wanted to take this opportunity just to encourage everyone to be thinking about your personal records and whether you have a plan for what to do with your personal records. So the next slide, please. So as you're considering what records might be relevant, it's helpful to consider these two questions that we have up here. So first is, what do you wish you knew about the generation before you? And what would you want the next generations to know about your life and your experiences today? So these two questions are just really helpful for you to prompt about what kinds of records might tell those stories. And this can be in context of any aspect of your life. So it could be related to your work. You can think about maybe what do you wish you knew about the people in your field before you. It could be related to education. So what do you want the next generation to know about what schooling might have been at this time? It could be your family. It could be your neighborhood, your community, your cultural community, your actual physical neighborhood community. But it can also be related, I think, in context of today's events. Just to think about these questions, what would you want to know about the life and experiences of members of the LGBTQ plus community before you? And what do you want the next generations of this community to know about your life and experiences today? So for archives, these stories are preserved and passed on through the records that individuals share with us. So next slide. So I'd encourage everyone to start thinking about your personal records and how you might want to preserve them. So you can consider donating your personal records to the City of Edmonton Archives. The Archives is always open to receiving and preserving these records because they provide insight into the individual stories and experiences that make up our larger community. And as the community archivist, I'm also happy to connect with each of you and provide advice or suggestions on how you want to preserve your own records, even if you would like to hang on to them for a while longer. But we can look through what you have and say, maybe you want to store these photographs in a more airtight or watertight container, or if you have film reel, maybe you can store it a certain way. So I'm also happy to meet with you to talk about how you can preserve your own records in your own space if you'd like to hang on to it. And I just wanted to note that, as we mentioned, archives are all formats. So the City Archives is able to take in different formats of records. So if you have floppy disks, VHS tapes, audio cassette tapes, mini disks, audio reels, anything like that, the archives can take it in. I just have a funny story from a times 10 event. There was someone who came and said he had just destroyed all his collection of floppy disks because he didn't know that anyone would be able to read them again. So I wanted to make it really clear. We can take in all these obsolete technology, and we do have the capabilities to retrieve information off it. So do look and consider what you have, even if you think that it might not be relevant or you're afraid that, this might not have any more information in it. You can always reach out to the archives and just ask, and we can take a look at it together. So the next slide talks about how you prepare donations to the archives, just a general guideline if you are interested. So if you're interested in donating records to the archives, there are a few ways that you can prepare these records. So one that is really important for archives and also for artifacts is the context of the records. So if you have records from an event, maybe you attended it, maybe you helped plan it, what would be really helpful is you were able to share what people might have been there, what the event was, what the date or even the year might have been. If you have lots of photographs, photographs are really important, but they might not have as much use to people if they don't tell us what it's about. So if you have photographs, you might want to spend a little bit of time identifying what people are pictured in it, what the event might be, where it might be, what the year is. So there's a different ways you can look at your records and prepare it a little bit for donation to the archives. Another way is to look at the different formats you have. So as I mentioned, the gentleman with his floppy disks, but you can also do kind of a survey of what you have at home and say, maybe you can let us know you have 20 VHS tapes, and these are ones that you made of your parents' anniversary event. Or maybe you have 10 DVDs of certain events. It helps us just to know what the formats are and how many you have. And then, of course, we want to know about you. So you can spend a little bit of time preparing some biographical information about yourself or your family. So these are just a couple guidelines of how you can start preparing yourself and preparing your records to donate to the archives. And then also I wanted to, next slide. I wanted to add to what Rob had mentioned about the Edmonton Curiosity Project and also the Rainbow Story Hub. So there are also community-based initiatives and memory projects that are available in different community groups and organizations. So perhaps you'd like to write a memoir. Maybe you want to share your stories with the Queer History Map that Rob just shared, or any other community history project. Maybe you want to organize a community exhibit. So in these ways, the City Archives is also always available to partner with you and any organization to continue this work of preserving and telling your story. So the Archives is also open to help with research and reference. So any material that comes to the Archives is open for access. So if there are certain records that you might want to see, you can always get in touch with the Archives. If you want to do research for your memoir, if you want to do research to write a history of a community organization, if we have those records, then we'd be happy to provide access and you can look through and build the history that way. And then I finally just have the last slide that has some of, you can't really see it in here, but it has some of my contact info. So I do have cards as well for anyone who might want to take a card. It has my email and my phone number and also the general contact for the archives. I also have a handout here, which I can share with the organizers and they can share it out with anybody who's online if you would like. But for people in-house, you can take a printed copy. It's just a guideline for individual or family records. And it's a little blurb about considering your family records and preparing them. And then at the back, it has a little table which breaks down the different types of records and what you might want to do with them. So for example, if you have receipts, then that is not archival. So you can keep it for a certain amount of time if you want, but you can definitely shred those on your end. But there are certain things in here that tell you you could consider archiving it. So this sheet is a really helpful resource that you can look at as well. But generally, thank you so much for your time and attention. and I will pass it over to Jillian.
Well, while you're opening my PowerPoint, I thought I would just introduce myself. My name is Jillian Richardson, and I'm the Curator of Labor and Industry at the Royal Alberta Museum. Much of what we do is similar to what archives do, but museums collect objects. We do not typically collect documents, paper, audiovisual material, etc. We collect 3D materials, so things like textiles, anything that's three-dimensional, that's us. We do work very closely with archives, so sometimes when people bring in a collection that has large archival components, we would work with the city archives or the provincial archives to divert those materials to the right place, and they would remain linked in our files, but we're mainly the repository for physical objects. Excuse me, so that's kind of the main difference. So we are a little bit different from the archives in that we don't have a designated curator to do collecting for the LGBTQ community. And in many ways, we don't have things identified in our collections in the same way. So for example, we don't have an LGBTQ history collection. So I thought my approach today, it would be suitable to just talk about some of the collections that we have as a kind of case study for why donating your objects to the museum is so important. Excuse me. I'd like to talk today about the architects Jean Walbridge and Mary Louise Imrie as a case study in museum collecting, to indicate why and how it becomes so important to take ownership of your own history and to preserve your own pride. Walbridge and Imrie, you may know, they've been part of the Queer History Project, and they're also on the Queer History map. Walbridge and Imrie were among the first women in Alberta to register as architects in the 1940s. Both women began their careers as city planners in Edmonton. Then in 1951, the two partnered to form the first women-run architectural firm in Canada called Walbridge and Imrie Architects. Their firm would go on to complete 224 architectural projects between 1951 and 1979. Jean and Mary were also a couple. They designed, built, lived in, and ran their architecture firm from their private home known as 6 Acres, which was located on 6 acres of waterfront property in Edmonton's West End. And the next slide, please. The two lived at 6 Acres until Jean died in 1977. When Mary died in 1988, she bequeathed their home and their 6 acres of land to the province of Alberta. The site has since been administered by the Parks and Wildlife Ventures program, which is a part of the government of Alberta, the Department of Parks and Environment. And Jean and Mary's house has been leased by the Land Stewardship Centre of Canada since 1996. When I first started working as Curator of Labour and Industry at the RAM in February of this year, so not so long ago, Walbridge and Imrie were immediately on my radar. Within my very first weeks, I think it might have even been my very first week in the position, I had people contacting me to inquire about Jean and Mary's lives and careers. It seemed super obvious to me that we would have their story captured at the museum. They were the first women's architecture firm in Canada. Super big deal, right? Their story contributes to the history of women in architecture and women in STEM professions more generally. And they're really important for the history of the LGBTQ2S+ community in Alberta. However, when we looked at the objects in our collections, they actually told us very little about Jean and Mary, about their lives, their business, and their important contributions to Alberta history. And if you could just switch the slide, please. Thank you. Instead, we found that when Jean was 20 years old in 1932, she was presented as a debutante at Buckingham Palace in London. Jean's court presentation gown is at our museum, and it was on display in 1989. And the next slide, please. We also have Mary's hat that she wore for Klondike Days. This was part of her Klondike Days costume, and the hat is circa 1950. This is not to say that these aren't important objects. In many ways, they're interesting historical objects, but simply to say that we don't know whether this is the legacy that Jean and Mary wanted to leave behind, the stories that they wanted to tell. In fact, very little of the museum's historical collection actually acknowledges gender and sexuality in modern terms. We just never cataloged that way in the past. It wasn't something that we used to frame the objects in our collection. Sometimes we even encounter objects in our collection that were donated by women that don't even identify the woman's first name. It will say donated by Mrs. So-and-so, and sometimes deals with the husband's life. So this is very much, I think, a product of our time, but it's fixed into our records. So we don't always have ways of searching collections in terms of modern frameworks. We have no way of telling what objects in our collections speak to LGBTQ2S+ history. And so it becomes hard to tell those stories at all within the museum context. And if you could just switch the slide, please. Just a few weeks ago, the museum was able to acquire the last remaining objects that were left in the home that Jean and Mary bequeathed to the province, so that we can better preserve their stories in the museum and to connect them to the photos, home movies, slides, and travel diaries that we are fortunate to already have in the Provincial Archives of Alberta. So again, we often do work very closely with archives to pair our collections, and though they're stored separately for various conservation reasons, we do work quite closely together. We're trying to fill the significant gap by bringing in new collections to the museum, but also by asking people to share how their objects should be interpreted. And that's, I think, super important for our purposes, the stories that they want them to tell. The Walbridge and Amory collection illustrates a few important points about preparing collections for museums. The first is that museum collections are always being used and accessed by the public, even if they're not immediately on display. I think we get asked that a lot. I donated something to the museum, why isn't it on exhibit? And I think people imagine that that's kind of our main purpose. And although it's an important part of the work that we do, our collections are always being worked with and researched in the way that archives are as well. We're there also to provide access to the public. Researchers are always visiting us behind the scenes. We're answering public questions, doing research, writing blog posts, giving public talks like these ones. The public wants to know about the LGBTQ2S+ community and collections at the museum. However, as was the case with Jean and Mary, we don't always have the collections, or we have limited context for how those collections were meant to be framed. That's a big question, right? What is a Pride history object? It could be really anything. It's about the stories. If people's belongings are donated to the museum by other individuals or after they pass away, they may not come to us as Pride history artifacts at all. In order for the museum to share the stories of Alberta's LGBTQ2S+ community with Albertans, we need both the objects and the stories that go with them. The other thing I want to encourage is to consider donating a collection of objects that speak to your experience rather than just a single object. And that's not to say we don't accept single objects, we certainly do. But this increases the potential for exhibition and also presents opportunities to display your objects in multiple ways, in multiple stories. So for example, with Mary's Klondike Days uniform, we could likely only really use that kind of object in a story or an exhibit about Klondike Days, or maybe about hats if it was made in Alberta, especially considering the limited information that we have about it. However, I could easily display and do projects and share Jean and Mary's architecture objects in exhibits about Pride history, but also about architecture history, women's history, or work history in the province. And this increases the avenues for public to engage with these collections. Finally, it's important to take control of your own history and to shape the stories that your objects tell in ways that are meaningful to you. We're not interested in objects just because they're expensive, historic, or beautiful. And I think that's similar to what Jaja was saying. We don't just collect things that are 100 years old. We do a lot of contemporary collecting as well. We collect everyday objects all the time. We're interested in the objects because of the meanings or stories that are attached to them by the individuals that donate them. So that's, I think, one thing I wanna get across. And I'm going to turn it over to Monica now, who's going to talk a little bit about an upcoming workshop that we're offering.
Yes, thanks. I'm just going to do a shameless pitch. So at the Royal Alberta Museum, we are going to be offering a Preserve Your Prized Possessions workshop on November 23rd. It'll be a 2-hour workshop where we will provide some this presentation that Jillian has done. We'll review that again. But then we'll also work with our conservationists who are at the Royal Alberta Museum. And you can say what item you might want to start preserving. And we can give you the tips and tricks like Jaja has done for the items that would go to archives. We can talk about fabrics, we can talk about papers or other wood items. And you can register for this event that we'll be offering. It is $60, but you can register in advance on our website, which is royalalbertamuseum.ca. And specifically focusing on the opportunity for you to get the right kind of archival protections. So specific boxes or tissue paper to help protect, manage that humidity that Jaja mentioned. Another horrible thing for objects, paper, is UV. So making sure you're hiding things in the backs of closets, and also how to capture those stories that both Jillian and Jaja have mentioned are so key to those objects for storytelling. So that's my shameless plug. You can register for it on our website where it says get tickets. Click there. You might have to click twice to get the full outline of programs available. It'll be the last one because it's just being launched today specifically, and you're the very first people who get the opportunity to sign up for this workshop. That's all I have to say. I'll leave it to the experts to chat more.
Thank you. I think I'm unmuted. To all three of you, as well as the last one on the upcoming workshop. Very much appreciated. Very exciting and I find, of course, very interesting, and I'm quite taken with how much is going on and how significant it is. We initially said we wouldn't have time for questions, but we do have some time for questions. And if you have a question, if you either put something in the box or raise your hand, and I know that people that in the room can help me because I can't see everybody necessarily. So are there any questions for any of these presentations?
We have a question from the floor from Patrick.
Just a question about, I'm doing a project on the queer music history and how it helped the Edmonton and Western Canadian community. So I'm wondering if you have any access to stuff like that. If there's any documentation in the archives as to what queer musicians did for the evolution of Western Canada.
I'll just repeat the question for people online. So Patrick had a question about, he's doing research into queer music and musicians in Western Canada and kind of the development over time. Thinking about the records at the archives currently, it's definitely worth looking into what we might have. Off the top of my head, I don't think we have anything specific. But the nice thing about working with history institutions, including RAM, is that we have connections with other groups and institutions that we know might have the information. So if you're interested in pursuing that further, you can always email the archives general email. And if we might not have that information in the archives, we will definitely be able to refer you to other places that might be able to help you with that research further.
So through the process, if I find that, can that be submitted to the archives to go on file with the city?
If you wanted to do like your own research and then put that research into the archives, is that what your question was?
Well, yeah, just because this is like you're saying, the museum, they didn't document queer history because they didn't want to. So I mean, it's like, that's why they didn't categorize it that way. So we have to find a way to make sure that that happens so we're not erased.
Yeah.
So that's basically what I'm trying to do.
I think that definitely is the way that the archives arranges things would be according to you as a creator. So if you are interested in doing that research and collecting that information and writing something out of it, the archives would definitely accept it from you as a person who worked on it and did the research.
Thank you.
Yeah, we have another question in-house.
Rob has a
It's
question.
great. Are we good?
Oh, hello.
So that's my mom. And we came under a total different umbrella. I was expecting to be able to come with her. I took the day off and that she would meet some people and I would get to say, hey, anyone want to go skating? Because my mom's having a hard time finding people that likes to skate. And in the regular groups that they have at Sage, normally they like to get the bingo and she likes to do the outdoor and the more, tougher things. But kind of glad that we stumbled upon this because I'm a social work and criminology and I own a very successful business in the city and I'd love to contribute in what you're doing here. So as you said, my mom doesn't end up being erased. Now I don't want to start crying here. I'm usually a really tough cookie, but as a child raised in a queer family, that might be something that I can provide. I was 2 years old, I'm now 50. I'm successful. It had zero bearing on my upbringing. I'm successful. They married. I have beautiful children, which are in social work as well. So I might collect your information when you leave, and I might be able to write something, provide some pictures, activities. I wasn't raised, I was dragged from hockey arenas to baseball diamonds. That's kind of how I grew up. And all my friends came over because I had the coolest parents. So I've got some stories for days. Thank you for meeting you all. It's just, if you have any other things that you guys all do, please let us know, because I'd love to be able to find some people to go and do activities. I know it's going to be a lot to translate there, but if you want to let the people online.
Could they hear that? Could the people online hear?
Yeah.
Yeah, they could. Yeah.
Yeah? Okay, perfect. Thank you.
I'd just like to also say there is Team Edmonton, which is sports, but stay for coffee and cookies
And
afterwards. We can chat.
Awesome, thank you.
Were there questions online? I wasn't sure whether
Don't see
Jan had
any
a question.
online.
So yes, Rob has a question, and Rob, you have to unmute yourself. Where did you go? He seems to have disappeared. Well,
If I may, Michael, I think
Yes.
Rob just wanted to tell us about another great archive resource that he forgot to mention. It's archive.org, where EQHP is in the process of digitizing resources like Times 10, Woman's Space, Fine Print, outlooks, and various newsletters from various groups who are active in our queer history. He says they're missing a few issues of Times 10 and Woman's Space. So if anyone has any of those materials available, he says they would be his personal hero.
Jan, thanks very much for that as well. Because I see he's got something through there. He is. Rob, I think did you have something further to ask?
No, I didn't. Guy does have his hand up, so I don't know if that means if he had a question.
No, Guy?
Yeah, thank you. I think it's a question for Zaza. I'm used to using a library tool for searching a database, or we're all kind of getting used to using Google to search databases. I'm wondering if I went to the city archive, like what tool would I use to search the databases? Like how would that happen? And I was curious if you can do any of that stuff online from home.
Yeah, definitely. The city archives has a database that's online. You should be able to link to it through the archives page on the City of Edmonton page. But I don't have the address off the top of my head, but there definitely is an online database. And once you access that database, you can search within it for whatever you're interested in. There's different ways to search. So you could put in somebody's name, or you could put in a subject term. And yes, so there is an online resource. Is there anything for Ram?
No, so unfortunately we don't have an online database yet. That's something that we're working on. But certainly our curators are always willing to answer inquiries from the public regarding our collections, and I'm going to leave some cards here as well.
Yeah, I would say if there's anything you're not able to find on the database, because it is a process, not everything goes on, or things are still in the works. So you can always reach out to the General Archives email, and the archivist will be able to help you further as well.
Larry has a question or a comment.
I had wondered about copyright and use of this material, particularly personal material that could be used maliciously, and so on. So where does copyright reside, and are there restrictions, any restrictions on the use of this material?
So there definitely is copyright on any material that people create. The copyright resides with the creator. Copyright really applies to what people would like to use with it. So there's different aspects of copyright law. I'm sure some of you might know there's like fair dealings and all of that. So if people are coming in just to do general research, then there is no copyright that applies to that. Copyright applies to if you want to use the material for something. But I think the better part of your question probably is related to privacy. Yeah, and how people use the material. So usually for material that people would like to donate, there is an aspect of the donation agreement that will allow you as the donor and the creator of the records to tell us as the archives how you might like us to steward your records. So you might want to say, there's this chunk of records that I would prefer to be restricted, or I would prefer that you ask me before you let people see it, or anything like that. So we do have a section where you can let us know how you would like us to take care of your records and in providing access to them. Generally, we also just abide by respecting people's public privacy in general. So it's if there's private contact information or any sensitive material, the archivist will generally keep that private unless the donor allows us to share that with people.
Thanks.
And I was just going to say the museum is similar. So whenever someone donates a collection to the museum, we have an option there that you identify whether you hold the copyright. You can identify whether or not you want to be disclosed on an exhibit label, for example. Do you want your name included as the donor? Do you want us to withhold it? And similarly, we would protect your private information. None of your contact information would be revealed, et cetera. And certainly if people had specific restrictions in mind, we would record that at the time of donation as well.
All very reassuring, thank you.
What if it's after the fact, like to his point, if somebody does something malicious with the information, is there consequences?
I'll maybe just add as a personal example, back in, it must have been about the middle or late 80s, we provided some information. We did restrict it because there was a certain magazine at the time that would go in and write some things that were, I would say, were pretty detrimental, and only two people. It had to get the approval from one of two of us in order for it to be looked at. We got rid of that quite some years ago now. That magazine's no longer in existence. It's open, but yes, the issue had come forward from that group. I know at least once when they were turned down, when we were asked and it turned it down. So at that time, it worked to do that as well. So, other questions? Then I think I would see whether, Jan, are you going to mention what's coming up next week?
Larry will.
Next week, we're going to deal with a subject that I think is important that we dealt with before, but can never do too often, and that is on frauds and scams as they affect seniors. And Eric Story has kindly agreed to give that talk, and he has some updated information about newer and better scams.
So,
And I'd also like to mention Rob put into the chat box the city archives link.
Oh, thank you,
Look
Rob.
at. What we're going to try to do is collect as much information, like the things, your handouts and names and so on, and send them out to everybody who attended today. And so here in the room, I'm going to pass around a calendar or a sheet. If you could just put your name and your email address, so I make sure that I've got you on the mailing list. And you'll also receive mails of upcoming events. You can always unsubscribe if you don't want that. I will pass this around afterwards, and please join us for coffee and conversation after we're done.
good.
That's really about it.
Good. So, thank you all. It's been I think, a very enlightening session. And I think, it does add a little piece to the month of October that was recognizing archives. We were a little late, but we did it. And I think it helps again to the discussion about the importance of archives and how to do it and what's happening here in Edmonton, which is really quite remarkable how much is happening here. When I think back to the days when I delivered that box of stuff, as far as I know, that was the first time there was anything there. But and now we got a ton of stuff, and that was, of course, before the RAM was in existence. Well, the RAM was elsewhere at that point. So with that, we'll thank everyone, and hopefully we'll see you next week, Thursday, when you can learn about how you can scam your neighbors.
Thank you for attending. Thank you for our presenters. Really interesting conversations. Thanks very much. We'll see you all next week.